Excellent. Well, good afternoon and welcome to Women in Science, presented by GWADA. If you are not familiar with GWADA, we're a 501c3 located in North Central Washington, where we're passionate about supporting technology, entrepreneurship, and STEM education. My name is Jenny Rojanasatian, and I have the pleasure of serving as the executive director for the nonprofit, along with a dynamic team of women who are here listening in today as well. I want to start by thanking our panelists and our moderator for spending some time with us on today, International Women and Girls in Science Day. It's such an important thing to celebrate as we really demonstrate the wide range of career pathways for young women in our communities and young men. So thank you again, panelists. You're here to listen to them, so I'd like to just introduce my moderator and my colleague, Dr. Sue Kane, who is also a PhD. She studied infectious diseases and biological sciences at South Dakota State University before moving to the Wenatchee Valley in 2011. Since then, she has taken on the role of the director of the Apple STEM Network and leads a host of initiatives in STEM, but also is a scientist and a really proud colleague. So Sue, I'm gonna let you take it from here.
Thanks, Jenny. This is such a personally fulfilling opportunity to moderate this panel for International Women in Science Day. And I'm so excited to be able to bring these three women and their stories into North Central Washington. I know that there are a lot of students that are watching and our business and community members that are going to be inspired and see things that we're hoping they'll stay with you. So I think rather than introduce you, I'm going to ask you, since you're all from outside of North Central Washington, if you would introduce yourself and kind of tell us where you're joining us from today. And I'll start with Dory and kind of work our way around.
Okay, thank you, Sue. I'm Dory Borgeson. I am currently the Dean at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Washington State University in Pullman. And I'm actually in my office today. So our college, because of veterinary medicine, has been deemed an essential workforce. So our diagnostic lab and our teaching hospital are open. And so we have a lot of students and faculty and staff here. And so I try to come in to my actual office so I can be a part of our program when I'm here. So that's who I am.
And Dr. Coe.
Thanks, Sue. I'm a professor at the University of Washington in the Information School and Computer Science and Engineering. So I'm here speaking from my home in Seattle, Washington. And I'm from Eastern Oregon originally. So I love Central and Eastern Washington and Oregon and have lots of family there.
Awesome. And Dr. Eglin, I think you've got the prize for the farthest Zoom this morning, I think, maybe.
It took me the longest to Zoom in too. So I'm Christy Eglund, and I was actually born and raised in Wisconsin, and I got my BA from Washington University in St. Louis, and then I got my PhD at the University of Iowa, and I went out to the National Institutes of Health and did my postdoc, and that's where I started my own research program on breast cancer, and I brought it with me to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I've had two positions here. I've been a principal investigator at Sanford Research, and I ran a lab and trained students. And now I'm the executive director of molecular genetics and immunology at a company called SAB Biotherapeutics. And I'll get a chance to tell you what types of fun things we're doing.
Yeah, I think we'll reverse the order a little bit, actually, because it makes a little bit more sense in the flow. So since you're all three women in science, but we have very, very different science journeys here, can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on?
This is me.
This is you, sorry.
All right. Yeah, okay. So currently, I had studied breast cancer, and I saw an opportunity at a company that opened up here in Sioux Falls, and they were looking for a person who was a molecular biology geneticist, so to speak, and had experience with antibodies and your immune system and how your immune system interacts with cancer. But they have an amazing platform, and that's the main reason why I came. They have transchromosomic bovine cows, and they clone these cows. And I can describe more detail if you want it. But the point is that they knock out the antibody genes of the cow, and then they replace them with the human antibody genes on a human artificial chromosome, or a HAC. And so then the calf is born and it grows up into a full cow. And we take a protein, and right now we're actually working on coronavirus. And so if you've been listening to the news, that the vaccines are made against what's called the spike protein, which is a protein that's on the surface of the coronavirus. And it's the protein that touches to the human cell and lets it into the cell. And we can talk about variants later too, and from the UK and South Africa, and et cetera, Brazil. But anyway, so we actually make the spike protein, and we inject it into the cow, and it makes an antibody response against it. But the unique thing about this is it's a polyclonal antibody response, and it's human. And so it's exactly the response that we would make in our bodies. And so the therapeutic that we use is human, and we can use it for patients who have coronavirus and then aren't fighting it well enough, and they can use this as a therapy. But just one more thing, but the real reason why I took this job is because I am starting an oncology program. So all of the monoclonal antibodies that are being used in oncology right now are all, well, I already said it, are monoclonal antibodies. And polyclonal antibodies aren't a thing because no one could do it. But now we have that technology. So I want to bring that to the field of oncology.
I love this. And I want to take this opportunity to encourage our audience members to ask some questions and engage. I know we've all gotten a crash course in immunology and proteins and antigens and all these things this last year. And so you may have some questions for Dr. Eglin, and you can put those in the Q&A. All right, Dr. Ko, we're going to tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now.
Yeah, sure. We'll move all the way from the human body to technology. So I study how people interact with computers. And so if you think about people playing with their smartphone or browsing the internet, all of those things, those are the phenomena that I think about. My particular expertise is in how people program computers and how they learn to program computers. So all of the ways that we make computers do all of these amazing things, there's a bunch of knowledge and expertise there, and it's quite hard to learn this sometimes. So I think about that learning process in particular. So I'm a fairly interdisciplinary researcher. I do research that draws upon behavioral psychology and social sciences and learning sciences and computer science at the same time. Some examples of some of the things that we're studying now are when we show people artificial intelligence, they often think that it's magical and somehow infinitely intelligent. And so we are really interested in understanding what those beliefs are and how those beliefs change when we engage children and youth in creating artificial intelligence through programming. And we find that, of course, that people learn that actually computers aren't that smart and artificial intelligence really isn't that intelligent, and most of the intelligence just comes from human beings.
It does give you a perspective and awe for what human brains are capable of doing when you're comparing it to what technology can currently do, huh?
Yeah, most AI is, like 2-year-olds, maybe 1.5-year-olds, that intelligent.
Some days I feel that more than others, I think. How about Dr. Borgeson, how about what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so I'm actually a dean and transitioning to leadership, obviously, but I still have a research program, and I really love discovery. So that is definitely what drove my whole interest in this world. So in the lab, what we do is we're working in the area of regenerative medicine. And so what we do is we run clinical trials in animals, so dogs, cats, and horses mostly, who have diseases who don't have any great options for cure or treatment. And so we use a lot of different approaches, but primarily stem cells. And those stem cells are taken from fat or bone marrow or placenta, and we modify them in a variety of ways. And then we develop protocols where we can treat these animals with these diseases and try to help animals. But the great thing about it is these, what we call large animal clinical trials, also inform our human partners. And so we also do a lot of work with the veterinary FDA and with the human FDA, where they use data that we generate to say, how can we best use these in diseases that are very much like human diseases. So we really do try to focus our efforts on animal diseases that really look a lot like human diseases. So right now, our biggest area is in immune-mediated diseases. So I like what Dr. Eglin was talking about, but we work with a lot of diseases where the body's immune system attacks itself, basically. So diseases like myasthenia gravis, or diseases that affect the brain or the gut. We have one that affects the mouth of cats and people. And so now we're using our cat data to start a clinical trial in humans. So we love that kind of discovery, but how stem cells work in immune-mediated diseases or immune system diseases is really where our focus of our research is.
That's really fascinating too. Actually, I kind of want to build on this idea of immunology. I have a follow-up question for Dr. Eglin, actually. I want to talk about your breast cancer research that you've been working on, because it was an NPR report actually that came out with the cows and the work that you're doing with the early breast cancer diagnostics. And I'll tell those that are watching that Dr. Eglin's research is probably soon going to put in the hands of physicians across the country the opportunity to use a blood test to diagnose early breast cancer, which would be really empowering and would, save 1 in 8 women has breast cancer in a lifetime. So it would save a considerable number of women in the process. And so I want to know, I also know that right now we're all keenly aware of that development process for whether it's biotherapeutics or our vaccines, right? A lot of us have this COVID knowledge. And so from a perspective of a scientist who's worked on that process, from the concept of something at the bench for a diagnostic test to something that goes into more of that clinical trial, can you tell us what that looks like to have that idea and go to a more general office visit tool?
That's a great question, Sue. Thank you. So I feel like right now we're sort of living science in real time is the way I think about COVID, because it has developed awareness to people about how drugs are made and how they have to be checked by the government for quality before they can go into a human being. So I told you before that my research was on breast cancer, and unfortunately I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and this was after I started studying it. So it was a very strange experience going through a disease of which you study, because I look at samples under the microscope all the time, and it was kind of weird looking at my own, I have to say. But in going through this journey though, I realized how important it is that when you're doing research, or at least for me, I wanted to make sure that the research I did would ultimately affect people and better their healthcare. And when I was treated for breast cancer, obviously the drugs worked very well, and the radiation and the surgery and everything else we went through. And I had a very aggressive cancer. And so if the drugs had not worked, I probably would have regressed, and usually my type of breast cancer, you would metastasize in like 1.5 to 5 years. So, but I didn't, and it was like, I almost lose track now of how many years it is. I think it's like 13 or something, which is pretty awesome, because you don't think about it every day anymore, But anyway, the point is, then when I was done being treated, I then, of course, bugged my doctors, and I would say, okay, now, how do you know if I'm going to recur or not? How do you know if I'm cured? And the answer is they don't. And I probably drove them crazy. They pretty much said, and what I've read is that a metastasis is detected by physical symptoms. Now, a metastasis is when the cells from the primary tumor travel to a different place of the body, and then they form another tumor. And once you have a metastasis, there is no cure for breast cancer. So you could see how this was on my mind continuously. And so the way that they're diagnosed is by physical symptoms. So if a woman is coughing hard and she can't get rid of her cough, or maybe her back hurts from a backache, her bones, or a headache, then they do a scan, and then they find that there's a big tumor there. And then at that point, the therapy is just to maintain the woman, not necessarily to cure the woman. So I wanted to design a test that could detect breast cancer when it was still curable. And so in my experience of using the immune system and thinking about the immune system, I figured I could use the immune system as a biosensor for cancer. And we were looking for antibodies that are made against cancer. And the reason why is because the immune system has an amplification process, natural. For example, one cell can make 2,000 antibodies a second. So you can see that if you can detect the antibodies, you can then detect the breast cancer. So we came up with this idea and we defined the different proteins that antibodies recognize. And we teamed up with a company called Inanivate. And it was just by luck that Inanivate we found each other. Our technology was biomarkers. They had a platform that needed biomarkers. It's kind of like an app in an iPhone. And so I've been working with them, and they have a licensing agreement for the patent for these biomarkers. And I still every week meet with them and keep track of the technology. And they are getting breast cancer samples and getting their test so that it can then go into the clinic, like Sue was saying. It was tough leaving that because it's so personal, but I realized that my contribution was kind of over. I mean, I'm still a scientific advisor, and it was time to move on and find another challenge.
I think that might resonate with a lot of our business community. The Technology Alliance has a lot of entrepreneurs that idea, that bright idea, and having that opportunity to, maybe part of that succession plan might be selling that idea and some stay with it too. So it's good to hear that you have an opportunity to stay with that project a little bit.
Yes, absolutely.
And it is going to make such a huge impact for women everywhere. I wonder though, I heard you talk a little bit about the just strange phenomenon of seeing yourself in your research. And I know Dr. Ko, your work is in that opportunity to look at the way that humans interface with technology. Do you have sort of similar places where maybe you see things that resonate with you as you're looking at the ways that our culture is maybe embedded in code and data and algorithms, and the way that AI is reflecting us back at us? Do you see yourself, or maybe some of the things that you want to change about the world and the technology that you're working on?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many ways that we don't even think of technology as being woven through society. And sometimes we aren't even aware of some of these ways that it's woven through. So one that's very top of mind now for me, and certainly it has been for, I think, much of us in the United States over this past summer and past spring, is the use of various kinds of technologies in things like surveillance and policing. So one of the topics, for example, is facial recognition. We might think of it as this neat little feature that's on Facebook or some app that helps us find photos that have our face in it, right? It's a nice little convenient thing that helps with our photo organization and tagging friends, right? But at the very same time, that's a technology that came out of the 1960s, out of the US government and the CIA, and it was meant as a form of surveillance against all kinds of racial groups, and including sort of other countries. And so it was a technology that was started at sort of monitoring where people are and what they're doing in our country. And now, just as much as it's sort of this technology that gets woven into consumer products like social media, it's also a technology that's used in police departments to try to detect when somebody might match a description of somebody else. And now we're seeing this an insurgence of sort of a large number of people who are being falsely accused of crimes. Usually it's Black people, because facial recognition technology doesn't work as well on darker skin. And so you have a lot of really challenging ideas here around, is the technology of tagging our friends in social media worth the false arrests and the false incarceration of Black Americans by police departments and all of these social tensions that emerge from that? So as somebody who studies learning, I'm thinking a lot about questions around How do we prepare teachers to have those conversations with youth in schools where you might have, let's say, one student who views facial recognition as something that's keeping their neighborhood safe, and another student who views it as something that's led to their community being falsely accused of crimes and maybe a family member being incarcerated. Teachers facilitating those kinds of conversations around technology and race and society. These are things that are often scary to talk about, and yet that's where we are at with computer science.
Yeah, I can imagine too, as I'm hearing you process and talk a lot about that, there are students out there that are really passionate about social justice issues, and they don't always think about technology as a way to directly work on social justice issues. And I really like that your work highlights an opportunity for youth to feel like they can take whatever they're passionate about and tool it to do that really important social justice work that they're passionate about. It's amazing. Actually, I kind of think this is a great lead into a question for you, Dr. Borgeson. I know you started veterinary school a little bit later than some, and I read about how you started your work in wildlife conservation, actually. And I know we have a ton of folks in the region who are passionate about climate science and conservation. Are there connections that you see or that you make between the veterinary science and the climate science that you at this point wish more people understood?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, specifically here, and I'm not charping on WSU specifically, but it is actually one of the reasons I really like this college is they're really passionate about global health, for instance, and they're also very passionate about agricultural health. So I started thinking I was going to be a wildlife conservation biologist. In fact, when I applied to vet school, I applied that very same year for my PhD at Berkeley in conservation biology. I thought, I'll just see. I mean, literally, it was that close to the wire, which one. And I met a couple of amazing veterinarians who were involved with wildlife issues. For instance, when distemper hit the black-footed ferret population in Wyoming and Colorado. And so what could we do about that? What can we do about elk hoof disease? What can we do about respiratory diseases in bighorn sheep? And so that's what I did my master's on. Ultimately, I decided to go to vet school and see if I could do it that route. And it's one of the things, I don't have any regrets about not pursuing it directly, only because when I looked at the people who were doing that, so I'm not sure if it's going to be a popular statement, but, wildlife conservation usually involves environmental conservation and nature conservation. And so when medicine get involved, it's usually because we're dealing with fragmented populations that we're trying to restore or get back together. I mean, you shouldn't have to do a lot of intervention in medicine if you have a healthy wildlife population. And so I really looked at the people around me and what they were doing and kind of made a decision that I was more interested in science and that, conservation was something that I was going to lead to people who are doing conservation, not veterinary medicine. But we do here, I have to say, have a great program in global health. So we really look, for instance, at how do we feed the future, right? And how do we do it in a totally sustainable way? There's a great term called regenerative agriculture, right? So what do we do in terms of genetic alterations, disease resistance, thinking about plants and animals and how they contribute to climate change, and how we really need to think about industry collaborations, human health policy, communications, all those things, even gender equity, honestly, that can make these things possible. And so, yeah, it's a big deal in veterinary medicine. It's a big deal in ag animal health. It's a big deal in global health and One Health. And so we are very, very engaged with that. And I love that. I feel like I've kind of come full circle without being that person myself. There's definitely a lot of interest and work, both in wildlife conservation, wildlife disease, all the way up to zoos, all the way up to global health in a veterinary school context.
I really love that nexus too of our ability to nurture and feed our growing population and that food science aspects of it, and then also balancing that with the conservation and the climate science. I think there's a lot of opportunity there for youth that are listening to find some meaningful change. Again, a lot like what we were talking about with Dr. Coe. But since this is International Women of Science Day, I want to do a little bit of a pivot here, since we know a little bit about you and some of the things that motivated you to the work that you're doing. And knowing about the paradigm that a lot of our youth have, or a lot of our community members have, that a scientist is somebody that studies for 8 years at university, and then they play out in the university labs and train students and write research papers. And this is the concept of a scientist that we're quite familiar with. And a lot of scientists do begin in those academic labs, but you three have some different ways that you've added on to or extended that role. And some scientists remain in that space, others are going to transition over, kind of like Dr. Egland has, into maybe more entrepreneurial aspects of research and maybe more administration and leadership types of roles. And we hadn't talked about it yet, but I know even Dr. Koh has reached out into training educators how to talk about technology as well. I want to know, how do you make that decision about the path that you're on, and how did you navigate? Where were those moments where you felt like almost a sliding doors moment, where you could stay right at that bench or you could go in a different direction? How'd you make that decision? And I'll open it up for the three of you.
Well, I'll start just briefly that, I was very traditional academic. Like, I was going to go academic medicine. In fact, the only reason I did my PhD is, at the time, in order to stay in academic veterinary medicine, you had to do a PhD. So I was interested in clinical medicine, I was interested in teaching, and therefore had to do a PhD. And I kind of went kicking and screaming. And the truth is about a year into it, I just loved it. Loved focus, discovery, challenging questions, finding out you could do that. I literally remember those moments of discovery when I actually knew something. So it was a nice transition for me. But before I made this decision to enter leadership, I was really interested in Dr. Egland's questions, because I was also, I do a lot of work with industry, a lot of consulting. We also are working with the FDA on a couple of patents we have. And I was really debating about whether to go into industry full time. They're fast paced, they're very directed, they're very applied. I'd kind of done that full circle, like, maybe I just want to get something really done. You know what I mean? Just like get this out there. And so it was definitely a time where I had to make that decision. And I'm happy. I mean, I'm totally delighted with my role here, but I definitely understand why people move in that direction. I think it's a great direction. It's a very different direction. I kind of encourage people to think about their career as chunks, right? Like 5 to 10 years, reassess, reevaluate. Where are you? Is it good? Is it not good? Do you have colleagues? Are you still enjoying yourself? And that's sometimes a question we don't even think to ask. And realigning your science. So I've always thought of my life that way in all my movements. And there's a lot of those moments.
I think I've had a lot of similar experiences around asking myself those reflective questions around, what am I doing and what do I want to do next? And I think a lot of my work has always had a service mentality to it too. Is there some impact that I can have through my research or through my other scholarship? And that's been a lot of the driving force for me. I did take a 2-year break to do a startup back in 2013 and 2014. And that was really this very different non-service thing. It was like a selfish, I want to go learn these skills and understand what entrepreneurship is and kind of be in industry for a while and understand how it ticks. But I wanted to bring that back too, and bring that knowledge back to the university. And so, and sometimes it's a very giving kind of orientation, and other times it's like, I just want to know these things, I'm curious about them, and I want to learn these skills and knowledge to advance my career.
It sounds like a yes and strategy. I'm going to do this and this. And
very typical of, curious people, is we're just constantly saying yes to lots and lots of things and learning lots of things in the process.
That's true. How about you, Dr. Egland?
So I didn't really know what a PhD was when I grew up, which seems kind of silly, but it's really not until college, I think, where you really know the field. And that my career path was really taken by my interest. I started in a lab as an undergrad at Washington University, and I absolutely loved it. And I was like, you mean you can get paid to do this? I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so great. And then I looked around to see like what the different roles were in that lab. And I realized that I wanted to be the boss. I wanted to be the one that, directed the research and helped figure out the outcomes and figured out what we're gonna study next. So that meant I had to get a PhD. So I went, and that's why I went and got my PhD, because I wanted to run a lab. And I followed the academic procedures, just like good scientists do, right? You get trained in the academic fields, and you go and do a postdoc at an academic place. And then I came and like I said, I trained students and wrote papers and grants and got funding. And the reason why I actually did come to SAB Biotherapeutics is because it was such a perfect opportunity. And it was a blend of my background and expertise with what SAB needed at the time. And for me, it's like walking into a giant playground or an artist with a blank canvas, because they have this amazing platform and now they want to apply it to like my favorite area. And I mean, how can you turn that down, right? I mean, it just, the timing was perfect.
I love it. Those doors open up, but you're also open to them. You're looking for them. And I'll quote Dr. Noel Schultz is in our audience right now, but she was one that told me about, oftentimes the science career looks more like a jungle gym than a ladder. And I think three of those stories is I went this direction, then I was over here, then I was over here. And that we don't always have it all planned out from day one. So I love that idea. I think the other thing, when we did our research for this panel, one of the things that we really kind of looked at was the underrepresentation in women in the leadership, the computer science, the biotech. One of the studies that we were looking at was talking about women making up 18% of the CS graduates and 20% of biotech firms, and only 3% of women in leadership positions in veterinary science. We're underrepresented. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, what we could do, where do we need to lean in and support women on this journey to make sure that we can work to a more equitable, at least gender-wise, outcome.
That's a great question. I've thought about this a lot as somebody who studies computer science education a lot. What is the nature of some of these inequities and where do they come from? A lot of them, in my experience and in a lot of the research that's been done, is that they're fundamentally about stigma, right? Who gets to be a computer scientist and who gets to work with technology and who gets to enjoy it and be interested in it and think about its applications. And for much of the, since the 1980s until now, the message has been, well, white and Asian boys get to do that and nobody else gets to enjoy those things. Some of remedying that is just making sure we understand history, but also making sure that we're visible and that diversity that does exist there is visible. And the history is that computer science and computer programming, for example, back in the 1960s, it was all women. It was all mostly Black and white women who were doing that work because that was considered this lower level task around operating a computer, right? Computer programming. How strange is it that we went from the 1960s where this was like a remedial task to something where now they're the most revered people and it's, they're the entrepreneurs that are shaping industry. So stigma can just reshape and change very rapidly based on culture. And I think that's a huge part of why we need to be visible, because that's how we reshape it, right? Is by saying, here I am, I'm a out trans gay woman in computer science doing education research and inventing new technologies. Just deal with that story and you can just figure out what that means later.
Yeah, I think for women, especially going to leadership or continuing up, a lot of women still have to look at their careers as a kind of a series of trade-offs and compromises, right? So we don't invest in childcare very well. That's convenient, that's affordable, that's where we are, that has the hours that we need. We are still primary childcare responsible people. Before we talked, we recognized all three of us are also mothers, and being a mother has really defined, a large number of my professional decisions. There's no question. Conferences, things like that are often shaped by those decisions. And so I think it's important to have role models. I always say, I won't lie, I was never going to be a chemist. I was never going to be good enough at chemistry, although I was interested. But I also would not have entered chemistry because when I wandered down chemist halls, there was no one like me where I went to school. And so it's important to have role models. I've just begun to understand that. And it's important to have policies that work. It's important for people to see that women are powerful and smart and capable. I mean, a lot of people suffer from imposter syndrome. I suffer from it. I still suffer from it. But it's important for me as a mentor to just continually tell women, you know, that they can do it, they can make it, that their own internal voices are not the only voices they should be listening to. So there's a lot of reasons that we don't necessarily do a great job, or that not a great job as women, but it's a great job mentoring and promoting and being successful. But we have to start acknowledging some of the trade-offs, especially women in relationships with other professional partners.
Mhm. Oh,
I think exposure has a lot to do with it. It's just the opportunity of girls to see what it's like to be in these professions. We all see doctors, right? Because when we're a kid, we always go to the pediatrician. And so we are familiar with a doctor, and you ask a kid what they want to be, and they usually say something that they're familiar with. But like, you know, an astrophysicist, what do they do during the day? You know, I don't know. My kids ask me that, and it's like, well, it's light during the day, but they probably still look out in space, you know. But seriously, it's the exposure and the education of knowing what is available. And I think that having forums like this, having career day, having people that, you know, are in that that job come and talk to people and explain what they do.
mhm. I love it. These are all really great. And I love that I was processing on Dr. Borgeson saying, you know, that imposter syndrome piece. And it makes me, that resonates with me even after earning a PhD at a table and feel like, I don't know enough to be here. These people are really intimidating. And I think that that might be universal. We also, when we were doing research for this panel, found some of the work that you all are leading in terms of equity and inclusion and making this pathway more accessible for women. In fact, a colleague of mine was just talking about pathways are made by people walking them, and you all are walking them and turning around and making sure that that access is more open than it was when you started, whether it's a you know, supporting other graduate women in science or working with kids. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you're doing or some of the things that inspire you?
I'll jump in there. One of the things that I think has been really important for trying to broaden conceptions of what computer science is just showing people how it does relate to the things that they're passionate about, right? If you care, for example, about veterinary science, it's helpful to understand the nature of how data gets woven through that and how computing is part of understanding that data. The same thing is true for a lot of other things in other natural sciences, but even things like social sciences, if you're really passionate around understanding behavior or understanding society or understanding the economy, computer science is part of all of those things too. And we don't often tell the story of how things like engineering and computer science intersect and integrate with all of these other subject areas. And so I'm really passionate about finding ways of preparing teachers that can show those really interconnected worlds to youth and help them understand that these disciplinary ideas we have about academia, they're really kind of artificial, and that when it comes into actually doing the work, all kinds of disciplines come into play. All kinds of knowledge are necessary to make progress on some of these larger problems.
Yeah. And I think it really speaks to the fact that we need to have all those voices and perspectives at the table. You know, I've been really interested in a lot of the research that's come out recently about how much diversity at all levels, right, really enhances the conversation, and where people can really add their own backgrounds. And I've been doing a lot of reading, and not even specifically in, you know, DEI research, but things like, you know, Noah Trevor's Born a Crime, or I'm reading this great book right now by a Native American botanist called Braiding Sweetgrass, about kind of wisdom, you know, indigenous wisdom in botany, and how different the perspective is. And I think in higher education, one of the things I'm largely thinking about is what do we do to remove barriers that honestly we had no idea existed, right? Like, I was raised in a pretty privileged environment. Like, I understood what it was going to be to go to an undergraduate, go to a school that was away from my home, and be in a college community in a dorm. And I was just listening to this guy talk on privilege, and he talked about how some people arrive at campus, especially if they're first generation, and have no idea what office hours are. Like, where would they have learned about office hours?
Right.
I mean, And it's just, I thought I would never realize that was a barrier, right? Office hours are for people who want a letter of recommendation. They're for people who want to have connections with their faculty members. And if you don't even know what they are and no one's taken time to define them. So I just have become increasingly aware of those barriers and the desire to really think through those, at least in our own college, but also at WSU. And we have a particular connection here. I'm excited by the people who are engaged with Indigenous peoples and Native tribes around the area. We're located on traditional Nez Perce land. And so I'm very excited particularly about those areas.
Yeah. What I like to do is I like to help people figure out what their passion is and what they want to do, what they're interested in doing, and try to lift them up and open up doors to help them be successful. I think that's one of the most important things that I can do, is just help people along their path. And sometimes I feel like if you're a mentor of someone, they think that they think that you want them to be a PhD in molecular biology like I am, right? But that is not the case. I don't want people to follow in my footsteps. I want to actually have the person create their own path and help them travel along their journey.
Mm-hmm. I just have to say something that is so important. I've had so many students who feel like they're disappointing me if they don't see me. And I'm like, I have no question, you don't need to be me, right? We all come with our own different skills. So I try to make that really clear from the beginning, is it has nothing to do with becoming me, it's becoming you, right?
I think
Exactly.
we're going to open it up here in a second to some of the questions that that folks are popping into the Q&A. So if you've been sitting on one, now's your cue to put some of those in. But I will tell you too, as I heard you all speak, one of the things that I have told students as well, the thing I regret most about my education experience is that I didn't take advantage of the access to the human capital. I was so intimidated by that professor or that scientist that I didn't ask them questions and get to know them the way that I wish I would have. I studied with some brilliant minds, and I was just, it was again kind of that internal value system of being able to say, I'm here, I'm paying tuition, but I still didn't want to bother them with my questions or my thoughts. And that is something that I hope more students feel empowered to do.
Me too.
Well, we do have some questions that have popped into the Q&A here. So they might not be as coherent. We'll pop around a little bit. But Dr. Schultz actually has a question. She wants to know what's a challenge or failure in your early career, and how'd you get through it? That's a big thing.
I'll answer one quick thing, which is just, I have to say, trying to get a thick skin in academia is really hard. And so the first time I got a grant, rejected a big grant, NIH grant, it had never occurred to me that other people got rejections. So I don't think as mentors we do a very good job, especially now, of sharing like successful grant writing and how often it is not successful, what the actual grant rating is, how many grants you have to write for a few to hit. And I remember literally just kind of being catatonic in my office and just sitting there with the summary statement and just reading it and just feeling so judged and feeling so, I was really ready to walk away, and no one had given me a framework for how to handle that or how to bounce back. I think it took me a couple of weeks, was not willing to share with people or talk about it. And so, yeah, I mean, now I look back and realize that was much harder on me, much more detrimental than it would have ever had to been had I ever had any exposure to people. So now I always tell my students, you know what I mean? This is what it is. This is how hard it is. This is how hard you have to work. And this is, you're going to have to develop thick skin, and you have a voice. And, it's really, that was definitely a kind of a watershed moment for me when I realized how far back that could take me.
And the questions keep coming in that Q&A. So if you have a question for any of our panelists or moderator, feel free to go ahead and use that Q&A feature. And Sue will get through as many as she can in the next about 10 minutes.
Well, I'll ask one more here from Beth Anderson. And I think this is probably a Dr. Eglin question. How would you explain polyclonal antibodies?
Oh, one of my favorite topics. our body immune system can tell the difference between its own cells, self, versus something foreign. And like, for example, a cancer can look foreign to the body too, because of its mutated and mutations, and the body can sense that, and the immune system makes different components that help fight and kill off, in this case, the cancer. Antibodies are made from B cells, and they look like Ys. I always, and my fingers are the part that is a variable region, and it binds specifically to only one thing. And that's what gives antibodies their power, is the fact that they only recognize one other protein. And that's why they're very specific and used for targeting. So our natural response against, say, cancer or a bacteria is we make many antibodies at the same time from thousands of different B cells, and the antibodies bind at all different places around say this is a cancer protein. So it recognizes my knuckle and my finger and every part of it, okay? And so it calls the immune system. An antibody is kind of like a white flag saying, come here, help me kind of thing. But so now that's a natural response. That's how our body responds. A monoclonal antibody is when you identify a single B cell and you grow it up in the lab, basically, and then you isolate the one antibody that is made from that cell. And it only binds to one single region of its target. So in other words, it only will recognize my thumbnail, and that's it. And so, like, we were talking about the spike protein on the coronavirus, right? And we talked about different variants that are occurring now. And this, fingernail here on my thumb has now changed, and the sequence is different. And so now that monoclonal antibody will no longer recognize the spike protein, and then therefore the vaccine no longer works, if that makes sense. So the point is that a monoclonal antibody only binds to one part of a protein. Polyclonal antibodies are natural immune response, and it binds to the whole area.
I love it. It's awesome. It almost goes back to what Dr. Ko was talking about earlier about the way that computers look at things and changing the perspective to be able to get smarter AI, maybe. Actually, I have a question for Dr. Ko here, and this is from Ingrid. She's 10. I want to know, was it difficult to learn all of the coding languages, and when did you learn them?
Thanks, Ingrid. That's such a great question. I'm going to give a sort of a metaphorical answer. So I remember my dad, when I was a child, just had this toolbox in the garage, and it was just full of all these tools. And I remember each one of those tools just seemed complicated in its own way, right? Having to learn how to use a hammer and a screw and a wrench, and there were all of these different uses for all of them. But one tool at a time, it wasn't so hard, right? Just learning how to hammer a nail and practicing that for a while, and then learning how to use a wrench and practicing that for a while. That's kind of what learning a programming language is. It just takes time to pick up the different parts of a language and learn how to master each of them and figure out what they're used for and what they're good for and what they're not good for. So I learned them first when I was in 7th grade in a math class. Our math teacher had us all buy graphing calculators, and he taught us a little bit about how to write small little programs to do just basic calculations for pre-algebra kinds of ideas. And so that's where I did my first programming, and then just little bit by bit, right? I learned a little bit more and got more confident and spent a lot of time reading the manual. That was my teacher back then, since we didn't have computer science classes in middle school and high school, and figured it out over time.
I love it. That's fantastic. I have so many good questions here. So I'm going to ask you another one from Larissa Rohrbach, another woman in science, actually. But she's reading a great book about people who are generalists in life. And the three of you alluded to your sampling across disciplines. As scientists, we often think we have to focus intently on one path to become experts. Do you feel like you're more of a generalist or a specialist?
I think science goes over time. So what I would say is when you're doing a PhD, you kind of have to be a specialist, right? You have to really focus, like you're going to be a specialist in one protein or one concept or one signaling pathway. And I actually believe that because I actually think it's really important to figure out how to ask questions and answer them. But I think you have the luxury as you grow more mature in your field to become more of a generalist. And I do consider it a luxury, right? So team science is more important, actually more fun working with other people. And so I now definitely consider myself a generalist. I mean, I know a little bit about everything. Well, not everything, not even close, like nothing about coding language. I'm just going to mention that right now, but a little bit about many things, and more now I consider my role tying things together and bringing people together. But I really loved the focus of a single thing when I was doing my early work.
Mm-hmm.
I'll contrast that and say that I think my academic career has just been to go broad in all kinds of different directions and become an expert at stitching those things together. There's something I really enjoy about understanding other disciplines and learning how to talk to other disciplines and figuring out what the knowledge is between disciplines that that disciplines really aren't paying attention to. And so there's a kind of expertise that I think comes with that interdisciplinary work that's different than being an expert. And I don't think I don't have expertise. I certainly have expertise, but it's not the conventional kind that goes really deep into something. It's the kind that really goes really broadly, but in a really intentional way to kind of build bridges between ideas and disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I agree with Dory. As a PhD student, you definitely have to be a specialist, and you do learn, you know, you're really great at one protein. And at that time, that's like your favorite protein in the whole world. But then as you move on, you realize that your PhD wasn't necessarily about that one protein as it was teaching you how to think and how to learn and what questions you need to ask and how you develop experiments to find the answers. And I think that's the general takeaway from my PhD is that now I can apply that to any problem that I encounter. And although the problem could be completely different from 1 month to the next, it's still the same steps that I'm taking to solve it. I also think that when now that I'm working in more of an industrial setting, I work with a lot of different types of people. So I'm working with like our administration and accountants, and also like biostatistics people and the manufacturers and physicians, and I can just go on and on. And so it's kind of like you might have one part of the puzzle, but you're relying on everyone else to help you put that in where it belongs so that it can fulfill and make the company successful.
I like that because it is a little bit of access to the general.
Yep. You got to speak different languages when you're talking to different people in fields, I found. So
we're going to answer Larissa's question with a yes and also.
There's a lot of those.
So this is the last question, and I'm going to hijack it a little bit to help you with closing our thoughts for today too. Dr. Sherrod actually asked about your preparation for this seminar and how that might help you grow. But I'm going to tweak it a little bit and say, you know, even in our conversation today, we don't have enough opportunities to have a conversation as women in science. So what are you going to take away from today, from your prep or your conversation or things that you heard? That's a tough one. And you have to do it quickly because we have about 4 minutes.
You know, I love hearing the similarities. Like, I really love being connected to women in science and actually men in science too, just a shout out to that. I've had a lot of great male mentors and friends and colleagues and allies. But so one of the things I always learn is that how similar and connected we are and how many great women there are in science and technology. But I think, you know, whenever I write the answers to these questions, it makes me think deeper about like why it was I actually made that decision. Because you go through your life, and I have to say I rarely thought very deeply. I just took the next step. I mean, I'm not thinking deeply about lots of things, but you know what I mean? Like, what's the next career step? It wasn't like this deep thinking process. It was like, well, that was the next opportunity, and that was the next opportunity, and I'll say yes to this one. And so every time I do something like this, it really makes me evaluate, you know, kind of those decisions making, a little deeper thinking about why it was and how that worked and what it really meant to me.
Yeah, I found to prepare for this panel, I actually went through the questions with my husband last night. And so I was saying, hey, Paul, when have I struggled? You know, being and being a good husband, he's like, I don't think you struggled, you know.
Yeah.
But no, he was first to point out lots of places where I struggled. But I think I realized of how dependent I am on my husband, and how now being a woman in science, I share the responsibility of my home life with my husband. And he, you know, he changed more diapers than I did, for example, when our kids were born. And he takes care of the cooking when it's needed, and he does the laundry when it's needed. And so I don't feel like I'm all alone. And so I feel like we're a team, and that really helps. And sometimes I think when like girls are thinking about what profession they want to be in, they think of themselves like completely alone, and oh my gosh, how am I going to have a family and a career and all of this? But the truth is that you're not alone, and you have a support system that helps you get through the stages. And some stages are going to be harder than others, like after you have a baby or after you're diagnosed with cancer. But you just have to rely on people to also be there for you.
I think I'd like to reinforce and then build upon what Dory was saying around, there are so many things that bind us together. There are so many common experiences that we have around being in science and STEM and academia in general. And yet there's also these really amazing kinds of diversity. So what I love most about a panel like this is hearing the other stories that exist. And if anything, eroding that stigma that really stops a lot of young girls from joining in some of these amazing scientific efforts is the belief that there's a normal, right? That there's only one path, or there's only one way of being. And I think showing the different stories that we have and the different pathways that we've taken really breaks down that idea, because there is no normal and there is no one path. There's just you and a lot of people who want to help you, and a lot of exciting ways for that to happen.
That's such a great high level note for us to wrap up our time today. And I just want to take a note and tell you what a personal gratitude it has been to share the last hour with you and to lean in and hear about your stories. And really appreciate Guada and Jenny for giving us an opportunity and a stage to be able to inspire our community and the youth that are listening.
I echo Sue's comments. Thank you, panelists, for participating today. What an amazing discussion. And as we conclude, I want to invite our community and all of you to engage in this work year round. Today is International Women and Girls in Science, but we really want to celebrate this every day. And as you all talked about, find ways to bring that into the conversation and bring women in these roles to light. So I encourage you to engage with our nonprofit, Guada, and the Apple STEM Network. For those of you who maybe joined a few minutes after the panel got started, we did record today, and we'll be posting that up and sharing it out in the upcoming week. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.